How strong is Loki from One Piece? That is the question we're going to answer in today's video. And you may say it's premature. I promise you it's not. We can do it. It can be done. We can accurately scale how powerful Loki is, at least given a certain window. And we can do this based on two criteria. Number one are feats, what he's actually done so far in the story. Number two is narrative. And obviously, given how he has a lack of feats, the narrative will weigh heavier, therefore I'll do it second. After we go over the feats, after we go over the narrative, I'll then give you my conclusion where he lies in terms of power. So first and foremost, right into it, the feats. Again, what he's actually done or things that have been done to him. Right now, Loki, he is very close in terms of physique to Ancient Giant, even more so because we now know in the Loki flashback so far that his father and his mother had very strong Ancient Giant blood coursing through their veins, and Loki's eyes probably being a result of the strong Ancient Giant blood. So Loki has, number one, that. Consider the fact that Loki was able to take a whole bunch of attacks from both Gunko and Shamrock. The Shamrock crazy Hauser missile Cerberus dogs with the swords actually going through his body. Loki himself admitting that he couldn't even handle that attack in chapter 1138, but still afterwards, Loki was able to stand up tall, at least temporarily, using all of his energy to try and fake out Luffy and company so he could escape and remove the last Sea Stone cuffs. Consider the fact that later on we see how someone like Gunko was able to devastate Scopper Gaban with a few arrow shots, and to be fair, he did take it deliberately to save Colin's life, but it's very likely that Shamrock can output more power than someone like Gunko, and even after all the punishment that Gunko gave to Loki on top of Shamrock's attack, Loki could still be active, whereas Scopper Gaban couldn't even muster any strength really after Chopper saved him. So in terms of durability and endurance, I would say that Loki's pain threshold, his endurance, is very high. I would, at a baseline, his floor would be probably similar to Law and Kid during Wano Country, where they could take a lot of damage and still keep on pushing despite how much damage they've taken. But his ceiling would be comparable to, let's say, someone like Zoro in Wano Country, where he had over 50, I think, some odd bones broken, and ultimately survived that, but needed a lot of time to recover, and even saw death after the mink drug wore off. And then even beyond that, you have Luffy and Kaido and Big Mom. That'd be like I would say the tippy top of the ceiling, but I would argue not on that level of endurance pain soak until further notice. And when it comes to his durability specifically, so things like tanking damage outright or taking very little damage from an attack outright. So we're talking about, let's say, the same as Big Mom's tankiness or Sanji's Germa tankiness. Because we have no feats for that so far, it's mostly for him just pain soak. We can only really assume that his natural physique right at this point in time is at least as good as other Ancient Giants. So when we see Little Oars Jr. walking along Marineford, taking all the cannon fire, all the bullets, not even budging, not even moving, not a big deal, it'll be at least similar to that. Of course, you have Haki as well for us to add a defense, things of that sort, but we don't know how good his Haki is at this point in time. If we assume certain abilities, then his ceiling could be definitely higher comparable to some of the greats of Wano Country, but that's more of an estimation rather than, let's say, going back to his physiology that is genetic, like let's say in the same vein as Kuma and his Buccaneer toughness. I'll stay along those lines until we get more information about Loki's actual raw tankiness. After we have his DC, and DC means destructive capacity. How much can he destroy? Given how Elbaf, to be fair, Elbaf is an area that is very susceptible to fire. Attacks, items, techniques, you name it, that can produce fire cause much greater harm to the environment than things that don't. But that being said, when we do see him for the first time swing the Ragnir hammer in chapter 1142. Damn! While swinging, there appears to be what I think is Conqueror's Haki infusion on the hammer. And then with that swing, a titanic bolt that spans all of that gigantic sword from the clouds, going from the heaven realm all the way down to the underworld, where it's even thicker than the entire road castle and even thicker than the bridge that leads up to the sun realm. Even compared to NL's feats, this is likely the largest lightning bolt in the story that we've ever seen by far. The bolt is large enough to encompass several of Kuzan's ice mountains that we saw on Punk Hazard. Several of them. So Loki's DC right now, just on one swing alone, is comparable I would say for sure comparable to some of the larger class blast breaths that we saw from Kaido during Wano Country. Attacks that would completely eradicate mountain ranges and smaller islands in the blink of an eye. But again, I do stress that lightning damage is amplified on Elbaf given Elbaf's nature. And now number 3, Loki's abilities, the ability feats. The best baby feat in the entire story. When you consider the fact that Loki survived that fall, started to climb back up the Jewel Tree Atom, but before that, took out a gigantic bear, and it appears to be decapitated with a clean cut, as if Sukuna did a finger point and just severed space. Maybe it wasn't an ability. Maybe that was just raw physicality. That is possible, I won't deny that. But I think it's better to actually assume that he has some sort of ability that allows him to do that. Because that bear should be not just your average bear. When Big Mom killed a bear when she was 5 years old, that was an average run-of-the-mill bear. Even though she was on Elbaf, it was a smaller bear. With one smack, it was dead. However, Loki, considering the area he dropped into and how we see in real time how most of those creatures are actually from Strong World, where it seems like the Strong World creatures that we see in that movie on those islands came from Elbaf originally, and they were modified by Dr. Indigo. If we make that same assumption for Elbaf at that point in time in the past, that means that Loki fell to an area that was inhabited by super creatures. These are massive titanic giga bears, bro. Ursus mega majors, Jonathan major bears. They're problems.
We just crossed the threshold.
But nonetheless, decapitation, and that was it. End of story. So Loki probably has a very unique ability of some kind that may also relate to why his bounty is a special bounty. Right now, because we know that Gunko is a member of the Menmayer family, confirmed by the volumes, it looks like Loki is the only person who is a lower world citizen that was offered to be a member of the Holy Knights. And this could be the power, not Conqueror's Haki, but this could be the power that Loki's referring to when he's talking about fighting the Holy Knights. And them trying to recruit him is them trying to head off an ability that even puts the immortality factor at risk. So only time can tell, but the idea is that Loki has likely a race-related trump card in his arsenal that puts him even further ahead of the pack for his overall combat ability. And the last thing real quick for Loki would be his physical strength. To put it simply, Loki is an absolute demon, because we find out in chapter 1143 that not even Hyrule can pick up the Ragnir hammer. And we saw how physically strong Hyrule was in Dressrosa, where he punched 10,000 ton Mach Vice sky high with the Gungnir punch. So someone who can send 10,000 tons sky high like that is unable to lift or wield Ragnir. Now, maybe it's because Ragnar has a certain trait to it, who knows? But if we assume it's just a size, it's that massive to where it can't be lifted and that dense. There's so much Uru metal compacted into it. Then what Hyrule needed to beat Mach Vice with that insane punch, Loki probably just needs a finger flick to do the same outcome, because he's that much physically stronger than Hyrule. That gigantic ship that we see the Elbafian giants roll up to Agate Island with, maybe he can actually pick up that entire ship and even throw that mythical class Nordic ship, and that would be relatively lightweight for Loki. Physically, there is a chance for Loki to be the strongest character in One Piece, where he can actually push and move and lift. When we see Burgess lift an entire mountain and throw that at Law and Company, it's not hard to believe that Loki could do something similar. And given his insane size, probably easier than even Burgess, who has the strong fruit. Just keep in mind that him lifting Ragnir compares him to Hyrule, who can't lift up Ragnir, let alone swinging Ragnir, which gives us a very damn good frame of reference. Narratively speaking, I think there is a ceiling that is established for Loki. There's actually two ceilings. One is immediate, and then one is a more overarching cap for Loki's powers. And let's start with that first. And that ceiling in a roundabout way comes from Skopper Gaban. Because when you think about it, before Luffy Company got to the island of Elbaf, it was probably the case here where Skopper Gaban was probably the number 2 strongest character on the island, and then Loki was number 1. Now, you could say that the ceiling for Loki would be Shanks, because Shanks did beat Loki some years ago, around the time Shanks became an Emperor of the Sea. So you could say that his ceiling is Shanks, but I argue his ceiling's actually not Shanks, but I argue his ceiling. Like, the best it could possibly be would be Kaido. There is a line that Scopper Gabon has in chapter 1139, where after he meets for the first time Luffy face to face, he says the line of, "I've heard stories about you, Straw Hat Luffy, including that you took care of Kaido. Boy, I'd love to go traveling around Wano again." That is a line, a statement said by Gabon relative to Kaido being in Wano country. Because Kaido was in Wano country, he couldn't travel around Wano country even if he wanted to. But now that Kaido's gone, he has that chance too. Kaido was the biggest deterrent from folks ever going into Wano country. Green Bull has a very similar line when he's fighting against Yamato and Momonosuke and company, where the reason why this place wasn't invaded was because of Kaido. And I think that this is where the buck would stop with Loki. And I'd argue Big Mom as well. Considering the terror that Big Mom is known for on Elbaf, I would say the buck would stop at that point. So essentially what I would say is that the buck for Loki, his ceiling would be Yonko level, actual Yonko level, which I think not even Luffy is there right now. When I say that, I mean the Yonko of the older era. So Big Mom, Kaido, Shanks, and Whitebeard. That cluster of Yonko, when they're first introduced, that I think is genuinely Yonko level. Big Mom and Kaido being the floors of that level from a prime Whitebeard perspective. Not old Whitebeard, but prime Whitebeard. And speaking of floors, Loki's floor, like the lowest point he could be at, I think for power, would be under Admiral. And that's just flat out gauging his bounty, where his bounty is 2.6 billion, but we all know that every Admiral in the story has a bounty of 3 billion officially. You could argue very fairly, I think very fairly, as time goes on, particularly with the strongest characters in the story, Oda is aligning their bounties more with their power. Is that always the case? Of course not, i.e. Buggy's bounty, obviously, clearly. But when Oda makes that move of making every Admiral at a 3 billion berry mark, you can then argue that Oda is saying to us, the readers, that if someone is worthy of that 3 billion berries, then they are also comparable to an Admiral in power. So I would say that Luffy is above Admiral in terms of power, Law is below Admiral in terms of power, but they are still at some points relative to an Admiral. And even though Law's bounty is higher than Loki's bounty, you can argue that because his bounty is a special bounty, that could equivocate his bounty to someone that has a 3 billion berry bounty. At the bare minimum, okay, that's his floor, he would be under Admiral, but he would still give Admiral a very, very, very tough fight. It's going to be a very hard fought battle, potentially for days on end. But you see how, in terms of narrative, if Loki can fight an Admiral to a very, very hard fought battle, he loses or he beats an Admiral, that puts him in lockstep very similarly to Monkey D. Luffy, who just fought and beat an Admiral on Agate Island. He would be the strongest character on the Straw Pirates except for Luffy. It's in a very similar way to Kuzan and Blackbeard, where I don't think that Kuzan could get mid-diff by BB, no way in hell. But I would still argue that BB is stronger than Kuzan. I know other folks argue against that. I think it's ridiculous, honestly. In 99% of cases, the captain is the strongest person on the crew. There are very few exceptions. Obviously, Buggy is a prima exception to that rule, duh, but I don't think BB is. So Kuzan can be close to him, but he is not as strong as him. Map on Loki and Luffy to Blackbeard and Aokiji, and you have essentially Loki's immediate ceiling. It's Luffy. Luffy himself said in chapter 1131 that if he needs to put down Loki after all his smack talk against Shanks, he would. And I do not doubt Luffy's capabilities to take down Loki at all. Loki, more powerful than Zoro and Sanji and Jinbei. He's not as powerful as Luffy. So if Luffy is above Admiral level, then I think the most we could do for Loki right now would be Admiral level. And again, that's Loki's immediate ceiling, but his overall cap, you could argue, could be around that actual Yonko level. And if you're being very extremely generous towards Loki, you could finagle a version of Loki who's just as strong as those emperors right now. But if Luffy, I would argue, is not at that point yet, I would say, let's say come the end of Elbaf, Luffy would probably be at that level, or let's say he could actually probably beat Kaido in an earnest one-on-one fight. But if Luffy's not there yet, Loki, I can't comfortably put him there either, because I do not think it's gonna be the case here at all, where Luffy would lose to Loki in an earnest 1v1 fight. And narratively speaking, Luffy come into this arc with a Nika ability and how closely related that power is to Elbaf, and then Loki being the false sun god, if you would, the destroyer version of the sun god, that'll put them more neck and neck. But again, Luffy is the genuine article, whereas Loki is more of a poser, unless his powers actually are Nika no Mi model destroyer sun god. Okay, fine, fair enough, like Black Sun. Okay, if that happens, I'll take it back. I'll take it back. And Asta and Yuno situation going on there. Okay, fair enough. But until then, right? Until we have the Black Sun versus the White Sun, I think that because, narrowly speaking, Loki is a fake sun god, Luffy is the real deal, that also puts Luffy ahead of Loki in terms of the power scale. So in conclusion, based on what I said before about the power scale in terms of feats and then in terms of narrative, I would argue that the highest point you can go for Loki's power level would be at that Big Mom and Kaido threshold. The lowest level would be under Admiral. And so the answer is probably somewhere in between, where Loki is in reality probably at Admiral level, or at the most slightly ahead of Admiral level, but he is not stronger than the immediate ceiling, which is Monkey D. Luffy. Even though Loki right now is injured, so his full powers will not be displayed. So unless Chopper has a mink style drug that can have him at max power for a period of time, there's a good case here that his full powers won't be on display, at least in terms of stamina and durability and endurance and so on. Luffy will only get progressively stronger as this arc goes on. Loki is more like finding out his ceiling where he lies now, but Luffy still only raise. That is it when it comes to my take on how strong Loki is at this point in time. Let me know your stance on the subject matter at hand. If you enjoy your boys' video content, thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, click on that bell to join the notification squad. I'm gonna catch you guys and gals on the flip side.
See you. Bye bye.